In this video, I want to tell you why we need async and await keywords here in this structure. This is a really common structure when we want to fetch some data in a React or Next.js component. So first of all, let me explain how this block of code works here. This is really common when you want to create a React component to fetch some data. So first of all, you have a state here. It's posts, and actually it's responsible to keep the data for post. The end result should be something like this. When we go to this URL block client, we get a list of items coming from this API. So we fetch the data, basically get the data from this API, and then we just update the posts state with that data. This whole thing is happening inside this getPosts method or function. And actually, to initiate the job, we need to call it somewhere. And usually we use useEffect hook to do this, to actually call getPosts when the component gets rendered for the first time. So that's the reason when we go to this URL, the very first thing it's going to do is go through all the lines inside useEffect. And here it's this function, and then it goes to this async function basically and tries to execute the code here line by line. But the difference here with await and async keyword is that when it's going to execute this line, it's not going to go to the next line until this first line is basically resolved, and then it goes to the second line and then wait for this line again to resolve again. And in the end, it's going to update posts by the data. But the question here, the very first question, is that why we use await in these two lines, but we don't use it here. Quickly, I'm going to explain it here, but throughout the video, I'm going to explain it in more details. Basically, what await does is that when the return is a promise object here, it tries to wait for the promise object to be resolved completely. So as soon as it gets the response, it goes to the next line. Now when we want to get rest.json, basically this also returns promise object. So in the first line we get a promise object as a response. In the second line we also get another promise. So now we have two different promises in these two lines. So here we can use await keyword to make it wait for the promise to be resolved. But then as soon as we have the data, there is no promises anymore. So we can quickly show the data. Now let me explain it in more details and do a little bit experiment here. So let me just get rid of this set post. We don't need it. For instance, we just want to show data we get. So something like this here. Now instead of render the component, we just want to see the data in the console log. And when I refresh, you can see that I get the data here. But now imagine if we remove all these async and await keywords, what happens? So first of all, we get an error. It says that we can't use JSON on a promise object. The problem is that, let me comment this line and also this line and try to print. So here, the very first thing we get after the fetch line gets executed is a promise object basically. When I refresh it, the very first thing it gets is a promise object. A promise class or object works like this, that as soon as it gets resolved, it returns a value. So here, the moment we get a response is going to be promise. Now if I try the same response with await keyword, here you can call it rest2, and actually we need to put it async. So now if I try to print it, log rest2. So here what should happen is that actually it executes this line and then immediately execute this line. It's gonna show promise. Then it comes to the third line, and here it's gonna wait for the response, for the actual response. So it's not gonna be promise object anymore, but actually it's going to be the actual result. We expect this to wait a little bit to get the complete response and then show the data we want. Let's try. If I try to refresh, as you can see, the very first thing we have here is a promise object. But then when we use await keyword, it means that wait for the whole response to come in. And then we don't have promise object anymore. We have the actual data. So now let's go to the actual second line here. So here we have rest2.json. And here if I don't use await keyword and try to print data here, we're going to see promise again. refresh. So one promise. Don't pay attention to the duplicated lines. It's because of React.js strict mode. Everything's okay with this code. Let me turn off the strict mode. So the only thing we need to do is come to next config, that's MJS, and turn it to false. React strict mode false. And now if I refresh, so here I have one promise for the first response and the actual response after await keyword, and now I have another promise for the JSON part. So that makes sense now why we use await keyword again here, because it also returns a promise object here. So we need to wait for the whole data.json. If I try to use this data2 actually to print data2, if I refresh, so the problem is that we can't call it twice, so I'm just gonna use this data here and just add the await keyword before that. So now if I refresh, you can see that first it returns a promise object and it says it's pending. But then when we use await keyword, it's gonna wait a little bit for the whole response and then it's gonna show the whole. But this concept is not really obvious here because the request doesn't take that much to be returned. So what I want to do here is I want to create a custom promise object to show you how it works actually in the first place, and then increase the time a little bit so that we feel it while we need it. I just want to comment all of these things, and I'm gonna create a fake fetch function here ACV. So I can say fake fetch arrow function, and here to mimic the behavior of a long request, I'm gonna use a timeout event here. So set timeout, and then as the second argument we're gonna pass the time, for instance 2 seconds or 3 seconds, and then here first we need to wrap it with a promise. So I'm gonna return as the response of this fake fetch, I'm gonna return a promise object basically. So resolve and reject. So the end result of a promise object is going to be either resolve or reject. Arrow function. And here I want to put set time out here, and I'm going to say resolve. So, and print a message for us. The data has been fetched. Resolve means that there is no error and everything's fine with the request, and you should return resolve when everything's fine, when you're creating a promise function. And reject means that there is some error with your promise. So here I want to return just resolve. After 3 seconds I'm going to use this fake fetch first, and then we can call it response here, and then I can print it out. So here it returns promise objects. So here if I don't use await keyword, response should be a promise instance. So let's test it. If I try to refresh, you can see that the result is a promise. But if I try to use await keyword here, it means that wait for the promise to be either resolved or rejected. That's the whole point of using await. So we use await in combination with promise objects. This is how it works. So now it doesn't return the promise, but instead it waits for the end result, which is going to be either resolve or reject. And for the resolve here, it's going to return this text. So if I try to add a console log here, starts here, continues here. So if I refresh, you can see that first we see starts here, and then after 3 seconds, we're gonna see the data has been fetched and also continues here. But if I try to remove this altogether, the await keyword, we're gonna see all the messages at once because it doesn't stop at this line anymore. And that's the whole point of using await keyword. And when you want to use await keyword, you need to wrap it with a function with async keyword. That way the program knows that this part of code should be followed by async principles. That's the whole point of using async here. It expects to see some await keywords here and act based on those. So it's not like that you can use await for everything. It usually comes with promise objects. That's when it means something. Okay, I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you so much for watching until now. Please subscribe to my channel for upcoming videos. See you. Bye bye.